Hi all, welcome to this first seminar. We're just going to wait another few minutes, I think, maybe 1 or 2 minutes to see who else might be joining today. While we wait, we might start with some brief introductions. So I know we have people joining us from many different groups and contexts today. So hopefully we have some master's students here from the Masters in HCI in the School of Information and Communication Studies, some colleagues from ADAPT, colleagues from other schools across UCD and even elsewhere. So maybe just for those who aren't so familiar, a brief introduction to the seminar series. So this seminar series is part of our work within the HCI at UCD research group. And so this is a very interdisciplinary group spanning, for example, the School of Information and Communication Studies and also computer science. I myself, I'm Kevin Doherty, an assistant professor in the School of Information and Communication Studies. And today we have Kaylee Moylan, who's been helping us organize these seminars. So today's seminar is going to be given by Justin Edwards. So Justin might be familiar to many of you here. He's a recent graduate of UCD and previously a member of ADAPT. And as I've been coming to take on more of a role organizing the HCI at UCD group, I've realized just how much of a key player Justin has been over the years in organizing the HCI at UCD group itself. So thanks so much for that, Justin. I'll just briefly introduce Justin. So Justin is now working at the Learning and Educational Technology Research Lab in the Faculty of Education and Psychology at the University of Oulu, Finland. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. And as some of you might know, Justin's research focuses on how people use speech to interrupt other people, the design of proactive speech agents, and the attributes and contexts of appropriate speech agents. And so in his talk today, I believe Justin is going to introduce the concept of using speech to interrupt complex tasks and talk about a little bit how we can go about tackling the challenges of designing proactive speech agents, drawing on inspiration from human speech interruptions in particular. And I believe some of this work is likely going to be drawing on your PhD research, Justin. So I think I can pass over the floor to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Kevin. Hello, and thank you all for welcoming me to an HCI at UCD seminar talk. As Kevin said, I'm Justin Edwards, a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Oulu's Learning and Educational Technology Lab in northern Finland. But you might know me better as an ADAPT-funded PhD student at UCD, and as Kevin said, a former HCI at UCD group member. So it's really special to me to be back as an HCI at UCD guest. I've many times been in the audience or in the hosting chair. So being here in the guest spot means I think I've filled out the trifecta. I've assumed every role in these speaker series now. As Kevin shared, my talk today will mostly be my thesis research, which I just defended this past August. My thesis title was the very long version that you saw on the last slide, or for short, using speech to interrupt complex tasks. It was supervised by Dr. Ben Cowan and Professor Julie Bernson at UCD, members of ADAPT. It was examined by none other than Kevin himself and Professor Andrew Kuhn from the University of New Hampshire. So without any further ado, let's get into it. I want to start by introducing the idea of speech agents. I know a lot of the HCI at UCD group and other people in the audience today might be working in this area, but it might not be familiar to everyone. So speech agents are these ubiquitous things that are in our lives as assistants like Siri and Alexa. They have lots of potential benefits. People notice that they might be useful for multitasking. They could be something that we could use to interact with a computer even when our eyes and hands are busy. That in the best case scenario, we could get information just at the right time, right when we need it, delivered to us in the perfect way. And this kind of fits with what we know about cognitive resources, that if your eyes and hands are busy, that if you're in a meeting or driving or cooking, an interaction using speech is going to compete a lot less for your cognitive resources than an interaction with a touch screen. So how is that working out? Are people effortlessly multitasking, having joyous interactions with speech agents? Well, not quite. Instead, users are trying out speech agents, maybe using them for a select few tasks and then leaving it at that, or outright abandoning the technology altogether. It's a far cry from this future that users envision based on sci-fi speech agents like what we see in Star Trek or Her, or in the new Star Trek even. I know there was an episode of Picard just recently with a speech agent. So what gives? Why do users give up so quickly on speech agents if there's so much potential there? Luger and Selin describe the reason for this abandonment as the gulf of expectations, that what we expect for our speech agents just isn't much like what they actually deliver. The perfect proactive assistant would be able to interact really proactively, to jump in and say the right thing at the right moment. But instead, we have these passive agents that sit on our desk that only jump in when prompted. They often end up giving us surprising, incorrect responses to our prompts, and they don't consider the context of the interaction whatsoever. The model we have in our head for speech-based multitasking partners really isn't matching the reality that current speech agents deliver. To address this problem, to try to bring into alignment the expectations that we have for speech agents as multitasking partners and our design for current speech agents, we need to better understand what speech that interrupts, that is proactive, is like when it exists as a secondary task. When someone speaks to you when you're busy, what's that like? To answer that question, I built a little online paradigm around the game Tetris. So Tetris is a task that involves a lot of decision making, it involves a lot of visual attention. So it's somewhat like driving or cooking, these really eyes busy, hands busy tasks that people say they use speech agents to multitask with. But it's a little more easily represented on a computer screen. It's a little safer to have people playing some Tetris rather than driving around on Dublin roads. So that's how I conducted my first studies. I decided to recruit crowd workers, and I told them that they would be matched with a partner who was playing Tetris. So crowd workers were taking this role of an interrupter rather than a Tetris player. I told my participants that they would watch their partner play Tetris, and intermittently they'd be prompted to ask their partner some questions. But instead of having a real live Tetris playing partner, I used pre-recorded videos. That way there was some control over Tetris gameplay. Everyone saw the exact same Tetris games in action. So participants would play through 16 trials of interrupting their partner, asking questions like, how's the weather, or what's your favorite color? And after each round, participants would rate how disruptive. Participants were told that their Tetris playing partner was rating how disruptive they were and how well timed the interruption was. And that these ratings would combine for a final score that would give them a bonus prize in order to increase some engagement. In reality, there was no partner, there was no ratings. Everyone got the same bonus reward in the end. But this followed some recent work on urgent and non-urgent speech, that this was a good way to make some speech seem more urgent than other speech, that if certain trials were labeled as urgent and these counted more towards your final scores, people spoke differently in prior research. So I was hoping that I could also observe the effect of urgency on these interruptions by manipulating it that way. So based on that literature, I had a few hypotheses around how urgency would affect the way that people spoke. Hypothesis 1 and 2 were about timing of interruptions. I predicted that urgent trials would come sooner after these prompts appeared that said, interrupt your partner now, and that they would be shorter in duration, that they would be delivered faster. Hypothesis 3 looks at some sociological work by Goffman. So in addition to understanding the timing of interruptions, I also wanted to know about word choice. Goffman coined this term access rituals, these little verbal and nonverbal behaviors that we engage in when we're requesting social access from other people, like saying, excuse me, or hey, or tapping someone on the shoulder, or raising a hand before you speak. I predicted that there would be more of these when interruptions were not urgent, that participants might take their time, make the interruption a little softer, a little more polite, if there wasn't this urgency attached to it. In addition to the quantitative hypotheses, I had a couple of qualitative research questions about people's strategies for interrupting. To get at these, I included some open-ended questions at the end of the experiment, asking participants, how did you decide when to deliver a message to your partner in urgent trials? And how did you decide what to say to your partner in urgent trials, as well as asking the same questions about non-urgent trials. So what did I find? On the quantitative side, looking at interruption timing, the interruption delay was a lot lower was significantly lower, maybe not a lot, but it was significant for urgent utterances rather. So people interrupted sooner if the interruption was urgent, as hypothesized, That effect was small, only a mean difference of a couple hundred milliseconds, but it was a significant difference. And that fits with our understanding of multitasking prioritization, that when we switch tasks for ourselves, we tend to do the urgent thing first, as soon as we possibly can. And that's pretty much what I observed my participants doing, trying to interrupt if it's urgent as soon as possible, and if not, maybe giving it a little extra beat. In the case of interruption duration, I didn't find any significant differences in study 1 between urgent and non-urgent trials, but looking at how small this effect was for that first variable, I suspected after my first study that that was just down to these effects being quite small and me having a pretty small sample size in my first study. So I didn't put too much stock into that answer or into that result, and I'll kind of talk about that more in a second. For access rituals, the excuse me's and hey's, I also didn't find any significant effect of urgency. This one I chalk up to the fact that in general, most people just never used these access rituals before an interruption, and a few people used them pretty much every trial. That urgency didn't have much of an effect. It was more down to individual differences. But that might be a starting point for how we understand access rituals in the context of interruptions, that they might be largely an individual mannerism, not so dependent on the urgency of the task. It might be something more about the social relationship between the interrupter and the interrupted party. The quantitative results throughout this, all the work I present are mixed effects models, linear and logistic mixed effects models. They're basically fancy regression models that take individual differences between trials and between subjects into account. I can talk more about mixed effects models later. Anyone who knows me knows that I have a lot of patience to talk about those, but hopefully that's not what you want to ask me about after. So we can also look at the qualitative findings from this study, the responses to people's open-ended questions. I performed a thematic analysis of participants' responses to those questions, starting with some deductive codes based on literature about multitasking and interruptions. And then through some iterative analysis, I ended up with 5 major themes that describe how people time their interruptions. First 2 themes are kind of the extremes, either interrupting as soon as possible, prioritizing just going fast, or on the other side, taking one's time, prioritizing accuracy. This is kind of borrowing terminology from multitasking literature, accuracy here being like making sure the other person doesn't mess up their Tetris game. The next 2 themes involve some more decision making. So participants took into account the Tetris task that they were interrupting or the content of the message that they were delivering. These characteristics might look like specific moments in the game. So this mirrors some literature about interruptions, that when we interrupt ourselves, when we switch tasks, we look for natural breakpoints, these good moments between subtasks to switch from one task to another. And it might be the case that people were looking for these moments in somebody else's task. And that's not something that's been studied much before, identifying natural breakpoints for someone else's task. So that was a pretty interesting preliminary finding. And then thinking about how we might use this to design a proactive agent, this variety of strategies is pretty interesting, that people might not have a set rule for how to interrupt. Instead, there's probably a bit of flexibility, that people are sensitive to different contexts, either social context, context of the task, context of the message. And it's not just like interrupt like this to interrupt like a human, that we have to be adaptive to context. Likewise, when it comes to how people structure their spoken interruption, what words they include, I found a variety of strategies. Some participants focused on the phrasing, so trying to reduce the number of words that they use during urgent interruptions, or trying to choose really natural sounding words, whatever they meant by that. Others focused on on how they delivered their speech, so opting to either speak quickly or to speak really clearly, sort of again mirroring this either going fast or avoiding errors. And this makes that null result about interruption duration even more interesting, that people are reporting speaking quicker during urgent trials, but it's not reflected in the quantitative findings. So it gave a little bit more credence to my suspicion that it was just a small effect, and a larger sample might help reveal an effect there, but we'll get to that in the next study. So just like the timing strategies, people adjusted their interruption structure based on what question they were asking. They didn't really tell me how they took the question into account. There wasn't a lot of richness in how they answered with that theme, but the fact that participants took content into account is still notable for the design of proactive agents, that context matters. And I include this long quote here where a participant expresses regret, where they prioritize delivering a clear message, but they wish that they instead just went with short phrasing. And we get some insight into the continuous nature of interrupting something like Tetris, that the participant was trying to time things based on the game, but that's really hard because interruptions take place over time, and the Tetris task takes place over time, meaning that a good moment to start your interruption might quickly turn into a bad moment as you keep talking. That's just a little insight that, like, yeah, of course, Tetris takes place over time, but it was made a lot more clear by a participant really saying that explicitly. So what does it mean? Where do we go from there? Well, first off, this study was a proof of concept for eliciting spoken interruptions. It was a lightweight way to get people to interrupt someone else's complex task. And it's a pretty flexible paradigm that I could have put videos of something other than Tetris in there or variables other than urgency. It also gave some early insight as to what variables might be worth considering for the design of proactive agents. For one, urgency seems to matter. The interruptions start sooner when interrupters believe them to be urgent. So that's a pretty concrete insight to the design of spoken interruptions. As for strategies, we saw a lot of diversity between people, that people just have different strategies depending on context and depending on who they are, that some people like to use access rituals, some people don't. That said, this study only looked at one explicitly manipulated variable, urgency. And I say explicitly manipulated because interrupters didn't have to infer anything about the situation. They knew that an interruption should be urgent because I told them that the interruption was urgent. Some research in this area suggests that people have a harder time inferring the state of someone else's task, that it's easy to take on board an explicit variable like that, but it's hard to take on board a variable that you have to guess. So I wanted to compare urgency to an implicit variable like this, something that interrupters would have to infer. And that will be study 2. I generated this image. This is what Bing thinks my study would look like. It's more ominous than I think my actual research was. I guess this interrupter represents Diego because he was one of my voice actors for the study. So that's him ominously trying to talk to someone playing Tetris. Not what I had in mind, but fine. So for study 2, back to the old trusty Tetris paradigm. This time I added another independent variable, an implicit variable, game difficulty. So I manipulated this by having some games start with more lines filled in and with pieces falling faster. And I didn't tell participants, like, this is an easy game, this is a hard game. They just had to figure that out by watching the games. A manipulation check showed that participants really easily could tell hard games from easy games. They didn't get confused at all about which ones were hard. The hard ones looked really hard, like the Tetris player was really laboring. And this time I was able to use study 1 to do an a priori power analysis. So I recruited a lot more participants, upwards of 90, which my previous studies effects showed would have good power for detecting the same effects here. So with those variables in mind, I wanted to, like the previous study, look at urgency. So like the last study, I predicted that urgent interruptions would be quicker and at a shorter duration than non-urgent interruptions. I was hoping to basically replicate the first hypothesis from study 1 and find a significant effect of urgency on duration this time. Based on some literature around conversation suppression, so the idea that when we're talking to someone else and we think that they're under high cognitive load, we try to make our language easier for them to understand. Based on that, I predicted that easy games would yield, easy games would have, I think I wrote this wrong, that hard games would have a shorter, quicker interruption compared to easy games. That for easy games, we wouldn't have to suppress our language so much. We could, give some big, long, wordy interruption. Whereas for hard games, we want to suppress conversation as much as possible and deliver something quickly. Likewise, I hypothesized that easy games would have more access rituals, that people would suppress their language more. For hard games, they would not bother saying, hey, or excuse me before interrupting. They would just get right to the point, make it as easy to understand as possible. I also wanted to compare the size of the effects of my independent variables, but I didn't have a good basis to form a hypothesis, so I left this as an open research question. Likewise, I wanted to check for an interaction between the variables with no strong hypothesis about whether it would be there or not. Like in the last study, I also had a mixed methods approach here with the same open-ended questions at the end, as I was interested in whether those same themes would more or less show up now with an additional independent variable with a slightly different research design. So let's talk about findings. On quantitative findings first, we can start with the explicit cue from last time, the urgency of the task. So study 2 did replicate what I found in study 1, that there was a significant effect of urgency on interruption onset or interruption delay. Same idea there, onset delay. Likewise, with a larger sample than the previous study, this time there was a significant effect of urgency on interruption duration. That's nice to see because the qualitative data in the last study made me think there really ought to be this effect of interruption duration. Now, this time with the bigger sample, we saw, this relatively small effect, only like under 100 millisecond difference between urgent and non-urgent interruption durations, but this time it was significant. Looking at our hot new independent variable, game difficulty, it actually had no significant effect on either interruption timing variables, so not on the delay or the duration of the interruption. A manipulation check confirmed that people were really good at telling easy games from hard games, but actually using that cue to modify their interruption was a bit trickier. I interpret that result as demonstrating that the more salient, certain, explicit cue, urgency, was more readily utilized for manipulating your interruption, that you're sure that this is an urgent trial compared to a non-urgent trial because it's said right there in front of you. It's written while you're talking, but it's a lot harder to take on board whether it's a hard game or an easy game because you do have to make a guess. While we're here, we can also pretty quickly answer the questions about effect sizes of the interaction. Urgency had a much bigger effect on both timing variables than task difficulty did, which I attribute to this explicit versus implicit thing. And as you may or may not be able to infer looking at these charts, there was no significant interaction between the two variables. In terms of access rituals, though, I actually found the opposite pattern. So just like in the first study, urgency had no significant impact on access rituals, but Tetris game difficulty did. Participants were significantly less likely to use an access ritual during hard games as compared to easy games. And this was somewhat surprising given the opposite findings for timing, that it wasn't that people were completely ignoring the difficulty of the game. They were actually using it to modify whether or not they used access rituals. I interpret this as something about the social information that's conveyed through the use of access rituals, and the extent to which the game difficulty is a common ground cue, that it's something that both the interrupter and the Tetris player would know about. That participants felt that it's permissible to not be polite when the games were hard, that you know the game's hard, I know the game's hard, we both know why I'm not being polite here. But during easy games, I gotta be polite. I'm like socially obligated to be polite, use an access ritual. This wouldn't be the case for urgency. That urgency was explicitly known to the interrupter, but was completely unknown to the Tetris player. So there wouldn't have been this common ground kind of explanation for why I'm not being polite. Like in the previous study, many participants didn't use access rituals across any trial, so this significant effect is really only present in the minority of participants who used access rituals at all. That's why my explanation centers more around the decision to forego an access ritual, the decision to not use one, rather than the decision to use one. But more studies on the use of access rituals are badly needed. People seem to have abandoned this concept of access rituals for like decades. So I'm like digging it out of its grave and trying to get people to use the term again. Study 2 likewise included a thematic analysis of people's self-reported strategies for interruption. This time analysis started with codes based on the themes from the previous study. So the final themes ended up a bit different and more consolidated. For interruption timing, there were broadly two strategies. People reported either ignoring cues of the game and always interrupting as soon as possible, or taking the cues of the game into account and waiting for a good moment to interrupt. As for interruption structures, there were again broadly two strategies. Some people sought to communicate urgency with their utterance using these shorter phrases or faster speech rate, and others sought to communicate calmness using a more laid-back pace, a more casual phrasing. For each of these themes, for some participants, this was confined to non-urgent trials, but for others, they reported using each theme across each urgency condition. So I don't split these themes by urgency condition because people kind of reported using them independent of urgency. So the takeaway from study 2 is that the paradigm was handy once again, that the findings around urgency on interruption timings replicate, and that maybe the implicit cue of task difficulty is too hard for people to use in real time to interrupt, or maybe they're already suppressing conversation as much as they can in the easy games, that there's no further suppression to be had in the hard games. Likewise, this showed that game difficulty does have an effect on access rituals, maybe because it's this implicit maybe because it's an implicit cue that's in the common ground, as I explained earlier. So one of the most interesting qualitative findings from this study and the previous was that people, again, tried to find a good moment to interrupt. Again, like this natural breakpoint idea, seeking the best moment between parts of your task to switch what task you're doing. But that leads to some questions. What is a good moment to interrupt a Tetris game? And people say that they're using these good moments, but are they actually any good at identifying them? Are they actually using them? Before I get to that, here's Bing's less scary illustration of what this research was about. I guess this more friendly voice was my other voice actor, Orla. So yeah, you can either be interrupted by the scary Diego guy or the somewhat abstract, nice Orla. So for study 3, I wanted to get at this mystery of what is a good time to interrupt a Tetris game. Prior literature indicated that to model a discrete task in terms of that you can model discrete tasks in terms of their subtasks. So you can break a task down into all of its components and use that to model natural breakpoints, the moments between subtasks. So like if you were modeling the task of dialing a phone number, you might break that down into the subtask of pressing each individual number. But Tetris is not a discrete task. It can be decomposed into sub-goals and subroutines, like move the square piece into the gap on the left corner, and maybe even further decomposed into discrete actions like press the left arrow key. But a lot of these sub-goals kind of overlap with each other, and it's not really clear that someone watching a Tetris game would be fully aware of how these interacting goals are overlapping for a Tetris player. So for this reason, I took a bottom-up approach rather than a top-down approach to categorizing interruptible moments. I didn't just watch these videos myself and label like, here's a moment, here's a moment. I instead asked participants to watch some Tetris clips and then select a moment that they thought would be where they would start an interruption. So participants watched a clip of Tetris at full speed twice, and then they were asked to pick a quartile of the video that contained the best moment to interrupt. And after they picked a quartile, they had a little slider like what you see here, so they could slide through individual frames and pick the exact moment where they would want to deliver their interruption, or to start their interruption at least. To analyze this data, I used k-means cluster analysis to look at which frame each participant selected as the best moment to interrupt. So the picture on the left shows a given trial, and each of those little stick figures is a given choice of which frame someone would have interrupted that video on. The color codes are the clusters that each selection was sorted into. So the number of clusters is selected algorithmically to minimize for the Aki-Aki information criterion. Basically, this just ensures that we pick a number of clusters that balances between minimizing variance within a cluster. So clusters are like well-defined, they tightly include your data, but also so the model is parsimonious, that we don't just have like 80 clusters where each individual point is a cluster, because that would be a useless model. So yeah, trying to maximize for having as few clusters as possible that give us as much information as possible. The red cluster in the middle there is visualized on the left with the relevant frames from that video displayed. So for this cluster, it was a really popular one for this trial. As you see, a lot of those little red stick figures. People generally agreed that the journey of this green Tetris piece was a good time to interrupt this Tetris video. To make sure I was only looking at robust, coherent, like real clusters, like this red one, and not wasting time on the ones like the one on the left or the right where there's not many data points, I performed bootstrapped resampling to generate new clusters, and I only kept the ones that consistently reemerged across resamples. So this red one is an example of one that kept coming up no matter how many times I resampled my data. So I figured that this is kind of a real idea of what a good time to interrupt this Tetris clip would be. I performed content analysis of these clusters, grouped them into discrete actions that took place in the sequence, and including the starting position of the Tetris piece, the final position of the Tetris piece, as much info as I could quantify about these games, and then formed some initial descriptions of each cluster, like just with my words. And then using our good old pal thematic analysis, I grouped these word descriptions into sets of descriptive themes that could define good moments of Tetris. Quickly, the first two themes are no spin and one spin, either frames where a Tetris piece falls vertically, moves horizontally, but does not spin at all, or two pieces do their full journey and only one of the pieces spins only one time. I know it's a little weird, but a bunch of people identified these long clips that had those characteristics as an interruptible moment. So here we are. The third theme was line clear. So this is when you get the line clear animation, you finish a row and it flashes. Anytime that this appeared in a video, this was identified as a good moment to interrupt, but not every video had this moment. And there were calm episodes as a theme. So this is an episode of Tetris is when the piece starts at the top of the screen and gets to its final location. So the calm episode theme is a sequence where the entire journey is featured in the sequence and nothing else is featured. And there's no more than 2 total inputs from the player, so total horizontal movements or spins. And these 4 themes described all of the stable clusters from that labeling exercise. So it made it really easy for me to go back to my prior data to see if people were interrupting at good moments as they said they are, and to see whether urgency had any effect on whether or not they interrupted at a good moment. So spoilers based on the emoji, you don't have to focus on my table of data. I just didn't generate graphs here because I didn't have any significant findings. You can instead focus on the face, because people were not very good at, people were no better than chance at identifying interruptible moments. This was true across both the easy Tetris games and the hard Tetris games. There was this weird finding that hard games had more interruptible moments in terms of total time than easy games. Which I interpret as maybe survivorship bias, that like clips of Tetris that were hard had to have a lot of these interruptible moments, or else the player would have lost. Like if it lasted a long time and was highly interruptible and didn't have any time to interrupt, then it probably just meant that the player lost, and I didn't even include it in the previous studies anyway. In terms of urgency, there was no significant difference between using interruptible moments to interrupt in urgent games versus non-urgent games. So altogether, participants, even though they report trying to pick these good moments to interrupt, there's not much evidence they actually do that successfully. But even with null results in study 3, these bring us a rich sense of the strategies that people use and that they report attempting to use when interrupting with speech. Altogether, the first 3 studies paint a picture of interrupters adapting their speech rates, their phrasings, their timings, and their use of access rituals with sensitivity to the urgency of their interruption, to the difficulty of the task they interrupt. There's a lot of light shed here on this everyday phenomenon, interrupting complex tasks with speech, talking to someone while they're busy. And these are a lot of effects that we didn't know about before. There wasn't a lot of research on this topic. So with all of this fleshed out, we can actually begin to look at the question around speech agents that motivated the work. I can actually make this an HCI at UCD talk rather than like a social psychology at UCD talk. So if speech agents are designed to interrupt proactively, interacting when people are engaged in a task already, and they do that modeled on human behavior, can this narrow this gulf of expectations? Can human-inspired interruptions that adapt to context lead to more appropriate interactions than proactive interactions that don't have this human modeled design? And this is an image of me with a head full of Tetris and social interaction expertise, giving this knowledge to my computer and the computer reaching back. Let's see if this knowledge transfer worked. So to address the HCI questions, I made one more online experiment in which participants watched blocks of examples of a speech interruption of Tetris, one block from an agent that adapts its interruptions to contextual cues in the same way that my human participants tried to, and another block from a static agent which interrupts the same way every time, doesn't take context into account at all. After each interruption, participants rated how well timed and how appropriate an interruption was. And after blocks of interruption videos, people filled out the partner model questionnaire, a validated self-report scale of people's perceptions of partner models for a machine dialogue partner. So how strong of a conversational partner is the agent. At the end of the experiment, participants were asked an open-ended question about the differences they perceived between the 2 agents. And I'll give you a very quick example of the static agent versus the adaptive agent. This is the static agent.
What was the last movie that you watched?
And the same trial with the adaptive agent.
Hey, last movie watched.
So the gender of the agent was counterbalanced across participants. So some heard a static masculine voice and an adaptive female voice. Some heard vice versa. The order of the agents was counterbalanced as well. For the adaptive agent, interruptions which were labeled to the viewer as urgent, came with these shorter phrasings, this higher speech rate, and more colloquial language. For easy Tetris games, adaptive agents used access rituals. So you heard the adaptive agent say, "Hey, last movie watched." The static agent never used access rituals. It did not vary its speech rate. It always spoke in full, formal-ish sentences. And the phrasings and the speech rates for every question were directly taken from real participants from the previous studies. So the speech rate is like what my actual participants were speaking. Like the phrasings were like transcriptions of actual participants' phrasings. So this was, as much as possible, just throwing a synthesized voice on these real interruptions that I observed and asking people what they thought about them. So the whole idea here is that agents modeled on human interrupters will help us narrow the gulf of expectations between speech agents and their actual abilities. So I get at this by varying the timing. Yeah, I just told you how I got at this, but I wanted to measure whether people rated the timing of the adaptive agent as more appropriate than the timing of the than the static agent. And I wanted to see if people rated the adaptive agent as more appropriate in the way it delivered its interruption than the static agent. And I just used single item questionnaires here. Like if I was developing this further, I would use better instruments, but I just wanted a quick first glance at whether people perceived these as differences between the agents. Likewise, I used the partner model questionnaire to look at the capability of each agent as a dialogue partner overall. And I also wanted to include those open-ended questions at the end to see what people perceived as the difference between the two agents. That way, whatever I find on the quantitative side, I could also explain with some rich qualitative data. So suffice to say, I was surprised by the quantitative results. For the single item questionnaires, on the timing, there was no significant difference between the static and the adaptive agent. That's not to say that participants didn't notice any difference between the timings. Indeed, in the qualitative data, you'll see that they did notice a difference, but there was just no agreement about which one was better. Some people love that one agent speaks really fast. Some people hate that. But this is more than I could say. This null result is more than I could say about the appropriateness question, where the static agent was actually rated as significantly more appropriate than my adaptive agent. Likewise, looking at the partner model questionnaire scores, the static agent was seen as no different than people's prior perceptions as speech agents, which is the gratifying manipulation check that the static agent was meant to be like what Alexa and Siri are like. And people said, yeah, partner model wise, exactly the same. But my adaptive agent was rated as a significantly less capable partner than both. So for my three hypotheses, the differences were in the opposite directions on two of those and a null result on the third, but that doesn't mean we can't learn a lot from this study. That's also why we include some qualitative findings. So some explanation for those unexpected results can be found here. The participants were asked to describe what differences they perceived, and from these descriptions, I performed thematic analysis and generated 5 themes, including 2 sub-themes that describe these major differences. Some takeaways are that first of all, there's large individual differences between participants. There wasn't any real consensus on a lot of these themes as which agent was more polite or consistent or appropriate. Across a lot of these themes, yeah, it's just a mix of people either saying, I love the adaptive agent or I hated the adaptive agent. Beyond that, for these sub-themes like rushed speech and human mimicry, those were only aimed at the adaptive agent. They made it clear that while it might be okay for a human interrupter to speak faster when an interruption is urgent, it just sounds unnatural and jarring from a machine. Likewise, mirroring some recent literature on conversational agents, when human mimicry is too apparent, this can be grating or annoying. So while adaptation can sometimes be seen as clever, it can also sometimes be seen as inconsistent, which is a major component also in the formulation of partner models, of machine dialogue partners. So while the motivating goal of decreasing the gap between expectation and reality might be correctly selected, this study showed that human mimicry only serves to widen that gap even more. People did not expect a speech agent to act like a person, and they didn't like it when that happened. So what did we learn? Well, when it comes to making a likable conversational agent, consistency is important. It makes it tough to add human-like traits like adaptivity to the design of speech agents. Maybe longer exposure to the agent or some guidance about its features can help make this less jarring, or maybe people just want a consistent experience when interacting with a machine. more research is needed to see if adaptivity can be done well in this context. On top of that, the human partner metaphor might not always be appropriate for designing conversational machines. You might not be too bothered by Orla or Diego speaking to you while you're playing Tetris or saying excuse me when they do it, but if this weirdo robot that's dressed up like a person does it, it might be a lot more annoying. Mimicry is creepy, and sometimes just having a machine sound like a machine is a better option, or at least making it not sound like a person. And I'm painfully aware that like Roger Moore is here and he's like the godfather of like this this idea. So maybe if I read Roger's work more closely, I would have predicted that ahead of time. Finally, different people have different preferences, so there probably isn't going to be one single design decision that bridges this gulf of expectation for all users. Instead, agents might benefit from being personalized to the preferences of the users. That might be explicit through the selection of a personality by a speech agent user. You might, when you get your new phone, pick, do I want my agent to say, excuse me? Do I want it to adapt? Things like this. Or it might be something that is done adaptively and learns from your own preferences. But take it from me, be careful with changing users' experiences adaptively because people might hate it and think it's inconsistent. So I can skip these and get right to the most important slides of the talk. That is that I had a tremendous amount of support for all of this work. So I wanted to say thank you to my supervisor, Ben, and my second supervisor, Julie Bernson, and also to my doctoral panel, Holly Brannigan, Chris Jansen, and Sandy Gould, and to my PhD examiners, Andrew Kuhn and our very own Kevin Doherty, and the chair of my FIBA, Liz Ferries. And to the many people who provided research materials, analysis guidance, programming help. This is Diego, Orla, Yunhan, Phil, Lee, Dan, Allison, and Anand. So many of the people that I'm thanking are like in NUI right now or on this call. So thank you all. And of course, thanks to you, the HCI at UCD guests for inviting me to speak today.